He was on his side of the front, we were on our side. The suffering was the same.
I think I'm gonna have to change these propellers and fly though. Maybe not. I'm not gonna change it. I'm gonna turn on the lights. And I wanna put this.
Because of the very strange situation in this part of the battlefield, I had somehow the feeling that they were like comrades. They went through the same things.
Part of the curious experience of being in combat was you could have an intimate relationship with your enemies under certain circumstances. And at another time you could quite cheerfully shoot them. It was a conundrum because the human side kept coming through.
After half hour it just stopped. There was a shell went over. I think it was one of our 25 pounders because it started off again. And we're back to square one till the end of it.
As the truce came to an abrupt end, both sides withdrew to their previous positions and back to the gory business at hand. Against all odds, over 300 Gurkhas and 70 Essex men had made it to Hangman's Hill, but their ability to attack the monastery is hanging in the balance. They've been cut off by the German counterattack and are now suffering badly from the effects of shell fire and a lack of food, water and ammunition. Agonizingly, the men who are now only 250 meters from the monastery cannot attack until they receive new supplies.
You only went out there with the minimum rations, expecting everything to come up as they thought everything would follow on, when it never followed on. So during that week they were dropping parachute food for obviously the Indians and the Gurkhas and us. But you had to risk your life to get out and get it. And a lot of the time you found that what you did retrieve was chapatis for the Indians, which wasn't our type of food.
See these things coming down, and we thought that, when I did, I thought they were bombs going down, but they were containers with supplies of food in. But there was hardly any of them fell in the Gurkha position. They nearly all fell in the German positions.
Es war eine sehr schwierige Situation, da inzwischen sich auch der Hunger bemerkt.
It was a very difficult situation because we became very hungry and thirsty. And since our supplies were less than plentiful, there was much effort to locate parachutes that had drifted off target. And I would say that we captured a large proportion of the things that were dropped.
Sleep you were very short of. One would sleep and one would stay awake, but it was jolly difficult. And sometimes when tragedies occurred, both of them had been dozing, and they were awakened when a grenade landed in their hull and finished. That did happen.
There was no question of sleep. You slept a few minutes at a time, but always with your finger on the trigger. The slightest noise, you woke up again. The tension was always there.
On the 20th of March, it was clear that the frontal attack on the monastery was over. And in the town below, little progress was being made against the paratroopers. For the Germans, the crisis was over. They had correctly worked out that the castle was the weak point in the Allied plan, and although they'd sacrificed almost an entire battalion of paratroopers trying to take it and not succeeded, they had stopped the Allied attack.
Was I pleased to hear in the end, after I spoke to Major Beckett on the 5th day, I said, we're getting a bit of a state up here. I said, so he said, well, between you and I, said, we are pulling out tonight.
What remained of the 1st 4th Essex Battalion made their way back down Castle Hill, the same precarious route they had struggled up 5 days earlier.
We handed over the castle intact, and we never lost it. And so we had achieved our mission in that sense. And when the New Zealanders said, now you've got it, make sure you don't lose it, we could say, well, we haven't.
Each company had gone up the hill with around 65 men. Some now returned with just a handful. Of the 400 men who had hidden for days in foxholes and bomb craters on Hangman's Hill, just over half made it back. German losses were almost as bad. The Battle of Monte Cassino was starting to take place alongside some of the most notorious battles of the First World War.
Did not look killer.
Once, while I was crawling around on the ground, I found a book, a German book.
Got a problem?
I read the text, and it said, there are two forces in the world.
I know
One is
what's
the
wrong
spirit,
with
and
my
the other one is
quad.
the sword. But never has the sword prevailed over the spirit. And I wiped away the dust on the book cover, and it said, the Battle of the Somme.
Die Schlacht an der Somme.
Alright, I'm gonna try putting it on the ground. Sometimes that seems to work.
The Gustav Line had held
Doesn't seem
for now,
Let's try.
but the biggest battle was still to come.
There we go.
For 4 months, the Allies had tried but failed to smash the German defences at Monte Cassino.
The guy looks
Now they're
great.
to try again. The German paratroopers wait patiently for the next attack.
Wir hofften immer auf geheime Waffen.
We were always hoping for secret weapons, and we knew that we needed time and had to win time. This was agreed by everyone. We needed time.
As all other fronts were failing, the defence of Monte Cassino had now gained huge psychological significance for the Germans.
Zu diesem Grammophon hatten wir 2 Schallplatten. Und diese 2 Platten
We had a gramophone, but we had only 2 songs. One of the songs was called Besame Mucho.
diese beiden Platten haben wir Tag und Nacht.
We would continuously wind the gramophone up and play the record again and again.
Und abgespielt. Daraufhin
Once, right at the beginning, we received heavy artillery because of the music, but it hardly damaged our quarters. Afterwards, we took the gramophone with us in the basement and used it there. I think by then, even the enemy enjoyed the music.
May the 11th, 1944. The regular shelling has almost stopped, and an eerie silence has fallen over the valley and the hill of Monte Cassino.
Auf einmal war alles ruhig. Everything was quiet. There was no artillery, no fire, nothing at all. You knew that something was about to happen. You could practically feel it.
The 4 exhausted German divisions defending the Gustav Line are completely unaware of the 13 divisions that have now been secretly built up against them.
Und dann auf einmal 11 Uhr abends. And suddenly, at 11 p.m., it was as if someone had put on all the lights. Everything was bright and we could see all the mountains towards Naples.
By the morning, Allied and German troops were now engaged in a battle 23 miles wide. But as before, the area around the monastery at Monte Cassino is the scene of the toughest fight. Through 1,500 paratroopers are still holding the ground around the monastery against tens of thousands of Polish troops. But during the evening of May the 16th, it becomes clear to the German command that Allied successes elsewhere on the line mean the monastery will soon be surrounded. The order is given for the paratroopers to withdraw.
Das kann gar nicht sein. Wir können das doch nicht.
That can't be. We can't withdraw. Withdrawal, that's a sign of weakness. We have to stand here against the enemy. A withdrawal, that was like a lost battle.
Gegenüber dem Haupt.
Despite the paratroopers' reluctance, the monastery is abandoned. 4,000 Poles have become casualties in their bid to take Monte Cassino, but when the attackers reach the summit, they find only wounded men.
Wir wussten nicht, wer rein.
We didn't know at first who entered the monastery. All of them had the same uniforms.
Und wie die reinkamen,
When they entered, we figured out that they were Poles. And naturally, we were not too pleased about that.
wir haben ja gehört, gewusst, dass
Oh, yeah.
vielleicht, dass
We thought that they may want to take
Dark, I
revenge
might have
on
one
us.
more pack.
However, we talked with them, and they treated us quite well.
verwundet und die haben uns ganz gut behandelt.
Rome is liberated. The Gustav line is broken and the Battle of Monte Cassino is over. But it now seems a hollow victory. The American Fifth Army has defied orders to cut off the retreating Germans and instead sent troops into the undefended streets of Rome, fearing that the British might get there first. Mistrust in the coalition is still rife. And only one day after these pictures were taken, the Allies landed in Normandy.
40 degrees.
The eventual success of Monte Cassino was completely overshadowed by D-Day. The terrible campaign in Italy was unforgettable.
We went back in late May after the Poles had taken it. We were offered, whoever wanted to go back to
So, I think I got one more
who was killed, had been taken
before
prisoner.
it's too dark.
I mean, on both sides, the Germans or us, no one knew who was what.
Before it's too dark to go.
I think we had to cut lots for it because they couldn't take too many. But I went back up over there again, up onto Hangman's Hill, and they were there lying there rotting away still. That's what I sort of always think. Poor men rotting away. It's terrible.
The battle at Monte Cassino was one of the worst of the war. At times, losses were similar in scale to the battles of Stalingrad and the First World War. Lessons must have been learned from the mistakes made here, but it was at a high cost.
If you are going to attack, you have to
Tomorrow, I
approach it
think
differently.
I'm going to
Not simply running into the mountain. Even a
Try
handful of men
6S.
could defend these positions. And when there were
I've already done
paratroopers,
6S
soldiers
on
with
this squad many
experience in
times,
hand-to-hand
but
fighting in
the
the
fact is,
mountains,
this is my
then it was
second
impossible
one,
to
and
break
the first
through.
one that did a lot
We
of
never
6S
understood
on.
their strategy.
The
It was
second one I
simply
bought
insane.
and immediately broke one of the prop
must have
shafts.
lost more than
So I was been riding this one. I've been flying this one with a mismatched KV, mismatched size motor, which is a Samguk Woo, I think, or Way.
The
The one
Battle of
that's
Cassino
2206
changed.
and it's
We
2700
went through
KV.
things that in the normal
And
way
that's next
no
to a
human
motor
being can
that's
go through or has to go through, thank
2306
God.
and it's
And you can't just cast off something
2450
like that.
KV.
Like taking
No,
off
you know,
clothes
It's
or changing a
it
shirt.
kept up,
It
essentially,
stays
but
with you somehow.
it's just not quite full power. You know what I mean? Like this one has never been as powerful.
You went back to Little
And I
Albany,
didn't try it on
you
6S
started
when
from
it had the mismatched motor in there. So now
You
that
get
I've
there,
got
look
all the
at them,
motors
and them all heads
back to
coming.
being the stock motors, maybe I will
Don't.
try 6S again. I like these motors alright though. These HGRs.
After we got back there and sorted ourselves out, collected as many people
They're
as we
not
could,
like the most
and
expensive,
realised just how
smoothest,
many casualties
quietest
we've had.
motors. They're kind of rough around the edges.
we were all glad to
But
get away from
I
there.
haven't burned any up. Like I burned up some of the Emax motors. You know what I'm saying? Like literally crapped out on me. broke the shaft because I'm just a brute of a person sometimes. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and fly this last pack here. On the Bat Pro.
In the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched over a vast area of the Western Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese forces moved quickly to capture Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, Borneo, the Philippines, and Singapore. By the spring of 1942, Japanese troops were in New Guinea as the expanding empire swept into the Solomon Islands. By the end of May, Japanese territory spread as far as the large jungle island that would give its name to one of the best-known episodes of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal. Japan's expansion was a seemingly relentless advance, but around the time they reached Guadalcanal, the tide was already beginning to turn against the empire. The May 1942 Battle of the Coral Sea forced Japan to shelve the idea of attacking New Guinea's capital, Port Moresby. In early June, the stunning American victory at Midway persuaded the Japanese leadership to halt their expansion into the Pacific. Consolidation was now the order of the day. But the empire was still a force to be reckoned with. In the middle of June 1942, Allied intelligence in the Solomon Islands reported a worrying development. The Japanese occupiers of Guadalcanal were constructing an airfield on the north coast of the island. Coconut trees were being felled in their thousands, and the reports suggested that the airstrip would be operational in a matter of weeks. This was serious news for the Allies. A Japanese air presence on Guadalcanal would threaten the precious supply line between Hawaii and Australia. Did their response. One idea was to carry out a raid against Guadalcanal and put the airfield out of commission. But eventually a plan was hatched that was far more bold in scope. Instead of merely raiding Guadalcanal, the Americans decided to capture the island. The plan was to effect an amphibious landing by American Marine forces, eject the small Japanese presence, and establish an Allied airbase on the island. By June the 25th, the decision was made to go ahead with the operation. Its code name, Watchtower. When the decision was made to capture Guadalcanal, the American planners knew very little about the background that lay ahead. The island was almost entirely unfamiliar. Maps were few and unreliable, and only a limited air reconnaissance was possible. And this was not the only problem that affected American preparations. The success of the Guadalcanal offensive would depend on the Marine troops, whose task was to go ashore and physically capture the vital airstrip. But when the Marine commander, General van der Grift, received his orders at his headquarters in New Zealand on the 25th of June, he knew that his men were far from combat ready. It was only in the previous month that the Marines had left their home base in North Carolina, and by the end of June, only a third of their number had arrived in New Zealand. General van der Grift had been told not to expect any operational duties until 1943, Now, his unprepared division was expected to go into battle in a matter of weeks. Vandergrift was forced into urgent preparations in New Zealand as his men and supplies arrived in the region. Despite an outbreak of influenza amongst his troops and the inconvenience of a strike amongst the dock workers in the port of Wellington, by the end of July, the Marine troops were in position on the island of Fiji, awaiting a final rehearsal for the task ahead. General Vandergrift had by now secured a postponement of the day of attack from August the 1st to August the 7th. But he knew that his preparation time had been far from ideal, and in Fiji, the inexperience of the American Marines revealed itself. The Guadalcanal expedition would be an amphibious operation, quite unprecedented in size, and the Fiji exercise revealed the logistical difficulties involved. There was little evidence of coordination between the amphibious landing groups and the accompanying naval and air support. Equipment proved unreliable, and the whole exercise was judged to be little less than a farce. But there could be no delay in the timetable. August the 7th would be the date when the American plan would be put into action. The intentions of the American leadership for the Guadalcanal offensive were relatively straightforward. An armada of transport ships would sail from Fiji to the Solomon Islands and enter the channel to the north of Guadalcanal. There, the main amphibious force would take to their landing crafts and go ashore, while supporting units secured the smaller islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tamonbogo. The transport vessels would not be alone. Instead, they were just part of a much larger invasion force. To the north and northeast lay a substantial protective naval presence under the command of Admiral Crutchley of the Royal Australian Navy. 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers. Generous air support was also provided. Some 100 miles to the south, an American carrier fleet formed into position. The value of the aircraft carrier had already been proved dramatically at the Coral Sea and at Midway, and so the carriers Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise were deployed to provide fighter support for the Guadalcanal offensive. Alongside the carriers, 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and some 16 destroyers. These substantial resources were all deployed in support of Vandergrift's 1st Marine Division, a landing force reinforced with crack units of paratroops and Marine raiders. But nothing could hide the fact that the 1st Marine Division had only been formed recently, and that the majority of its men lacked any experience of battle. The American Marines could not be sure of the size of the force that awaited them on Guadalcanal, but they could guess at the strength of the Japanese fighting spirit. The best intelligence available suggested that a force of 7,000 troops were in position on the island, and these were likely to include soldiers with recent experience of fighting in difficult jungle conditions. By contrast, there were few men in the American Marines who had ever come across an environment like that of Guadalcanal. The Americans also knew that Japanese strength did not derive only from its positions at Guadalcanal itself. Somewhere to the northwest, in the vicinity of New Britain, lurked the might of Japanese naval power, the 4th Inner South Sea Fleet. These were the concerns that faced the American commanders on the eve of battle in early August 1942. In overall command of the Watchtower operation was Vice Admiral Robert Lee Gormley. A 57-year-old who had served as a liaison officer in London, Gormley arrived in New Zealand in March 1942 to take up command of the South Pacific area and South Pacific Force. Not long afterwards, he received the order to proceed with the Guadalcanal attack. But Gormley would not be in the South Pacific when the fighting finally ended. His eventual removal may have been the result of one of his decisions in the early days of the offensive.
Yeah, that's the last pack.
But in August
I'm outta
1942,
here. See?
Admiral Gormley was the man in charge. Amongst his subordinates, Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher